Hello, brothers and sisters, friends and neighbors. Today I would like to talk to you about the Pope's blessing and how it changed my life. But first, I am going to talk about several people who have received the Pope's blessing over the centuries. And don't worry, I'll try to make it quick. Our journey through time begins with Alberto d'Este, who in 1391 founded the University of Ferrara and received a golden rose, which is a flower-shaped trophy blessed by the Pope. 2 years later, his wife Giovanna died. In 1477, Ludovico III, ruler of Mantua, received the golden rose. He died in a plague the following year. In 1486, King James III of Scotland received the golden rose. 2 years later, he died in battle while his eldest son was captured. 1555, Queen Mary I of England received the golden rose. Soon after, she died from ovarian cancer and surrendered her throne to Elizabeth I. In 1560, Mary Queen of Scots received the golden rose. Shortly after, her husband Francis I died. In 1572, King Charles IX of France received the golden rose. 2 years later, he died from tuberculosis. In 1588, the invincible Spanish Armada received its blessing from the Pope, only to be defeated by England and by rough weather. Fast forward to 1866, when Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria had knelt down before the Pope, Pius IX, and begged him for a blessing, which he was given. After that, he lost the Austro-Prussian War. In 1867, Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico, having been blessed by the Pope, was now being overthrown by his own people and then executed. In 1868, Queen Isabella II of Spain had received the Golden Rose, but shortly after she was deposed during the Glorious Revolution. In 1897, the Charity Bazaar was held in Paris, France. A papal nuncio came by to bless the event. Shortly after, the building went up in flames, killing 126 people and injuring 250. On to the 20th century. In 1928, the airship Italia took flight. On board was a wooden cross blessed by the Pope and given to General Umberto Nobile. The airship crashed during its voyage, and the general sustained serious injuries. Some of the crew members were also lost. In 1957, French President René Coty met with the Pope. The following year saw the collapse of the French Fourth Republic. In 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy met with the Pope and was blessed by him. Later that same year, President Kennedy was assassinated. Then, in 1964, Sukarno, President of Indonesia, met with the Pope. Within 3 years, he was overthrown and placed under house arrest at Bogor Palace. There, he was denied proper medical care, which led to his death from liver failure in 1970. In 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson, U.S. President, met with the Pope. That same year, America went to war with Vietnam. President Johnson had to deal with anti-war protests and intense urban riots that broke out during his presidency. The Viet Cong forces attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. By 1968, his popularity had plummeted. He resigned that year. In 1970, the Pope visited Pakistan. Then Pakistan lost some of their land following the defeat in the Indo-Pakistani War. That same year, President Yahya Khan was forced to resign. Also in 1970, the Pope visited Australia. The following year, Prime Minister John Gorton was attacked on the floor of Parliament and wound up resigning. One more incident took place in 1970. Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia visited the Vatican. 2 years later, severe famine and drought hit Ethiopia. In 1974, Emperor Selassie was deposed and placed under house arrest, only to die the next year without a funeral service. In 1979, Pope John Paul II visited Turkey, where he met with the Prime Minister Süleyman Demirel, who would then be overthrown by General Kenan Evren in the 1980 military coup. Also in 1980, the Pope went on to visit Ghana, where Hilla Liman was president. On December 31, 1981, the Liman administration was overthrown. In February of 1981, the Pope visited the Philippines, which gladly received his blessings. From March to November, the nation was hit with an above-average typhoon season that caused over 1,200 fatalities and over $280 million in damages. In 1985, the Pope visited Cameroon. The following year, 1,700 people were killed off by a volcanic gas eruption coming from Lake Nyos. Even an entire village was wiped out by the disaster. From September the 10th to the 19th of 1987, the Pope visited the United States. 1 month later, the stock market crashed. Let's move on to the 21st century. In 2002, the Pope visited Toronto. In that same city, the SARS epidemic broke out within the next year. On July the 13th, 2008, in New South Wales, Australia, the Premier Maurice Yema greeted the Pope and asked him for a blessing. Later that year, Yema lost the support of his people and went on to resign in September. To make matters worse, he was hospitalized in May of 2009 with an acute brain inflammation. Also in 2008, the Pope visited New York City earlier that year, but later that year, the stock market crashed once again, and there was a great recession. And last but not least, here is my personal story. Let's begin in the year 2009. I had a nice job at the library, was attending a really good church, shared a nice apartment in a safe neighborhood with a male roommate, and had a successful evangelism ministry. Everything seemed to be going well. In 2010, during one of my outreaches, I went to a flea market and purchased a silver-plated crucifix pendant. The vendor told me that it was blessed by the Pope. When I got home, I prayed over it and anointed it with oil so that I could consecrate it for the work of the Lord, using it as a witnessing tool. But towards the end of that year, I began to experience conflicts with people from my church and having problems at home. In 2011, despite having a healthy diet and not catching colds for over 2 years, I began to experience frequent sore throats and often got sick for no apparent reason. Even my sinuses were a mess, despite all the medications I was taking. On top of all that, I had a falling out with my roommate, who moved out and left me with an expensive cable bill. After that, I began to experience panic attacks, heart palpitations, and bouts of insomnia. 2012 was the year when everything went downhill. I went to one doctor visit after the other and was hospitalized for my panic disorder. But the doctors could not find anything wrong. We were all puzzled. Around that time, I had friends turn against me, and my problems got so bad that even the pastor couldn't help me, so I left. Then, I got a new roommate, and he seemed like a nice guy, but then he got me into so much trouble that I wound up having to move back with my parents, who at that time were living in a tough neighborhood. My ministry also failed, and as for my job, I had to resign due to health issues. My whole life went crashing down. By now we can see that the Pope's blessing is not the blessing that many people think it is. There's too many coincidences. Anointing the crucifix with oil and praying over it did not remove the papal blessing from it, and I have biblical proof of that. Let's read 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 4. It was he who removed the high places, shattered the pillars, cut down the Asherah, and smashed the bronze serpent Moses had made because up to that time the Israelites were burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. Interestingly, in Malachi chapter 2 verse 2, God says to certain religious leaders, "Your blessing I will curse." Even King Hezekiah knew that any religious sculpture that is cursed or idolized must be destroyed or disposed of. So I got rid of my crucifix. Now please understand that I am not trying to bash Catholicism, nor do I hate on the Pope. In fact, I love everybody, but we must never put our faith in any blessed object, nor in any human being. Only have faith in Jesus. Anyway, I humbly apologize to anybody who might have been offended by my testimony, but I'm only looking to obey the triune God, whom I believe has asked me to present this solemn warning to anyone who desires a blessing from the Pope or from any Vatican official. You might also be wondering, what happens to people who receive the Pope's curse instead of the papal blessing? Let's look at the story of Victor Emmanuel II, a man who was excommunicated and cursed by the Pope in 1860. The year after, Victor Emmanuel became successful in the Italian unification and was crowned king of the newly established Kingdom of Italy. A monument was built in honor of him. Giuseppe Garibaldi was also cursed by the Pope for his rebellion against the Roman Catholic Church. Garibaldi, now Protestant, went on to help his fellow Italians win the war against the Austrian Empire and successfully capture the city of Rome for the Kingdom of Italy. Monuments were built of him across the world. Military ships and even theaters were named after him. Call me a crazy heretic, but I'd rather be cursed by the Pope instead of getting a papal blessing. Who would you rather get your blessings from? The Pope, a finite man, or Jesus, the infinite God? The choice is entirely up to you. Here is a suggested prayer for removing the papal blessing. In the meantime, I would like to thank God, YouTube, and EasyVid for making this production possible. Thank you for tuning in, and may God bless you.